Thank you for joining me for this webinar today. I'm really excited to talk with you all about self-advocacy for women living with paralysis. And I'm hoping that you will be able to walk away from this presentation today with some new perspectives, ideas, strategies, and skills for becoming a stronger self-advocate in your own life. I am happy to be a resource for you on this topic, and we will absolutely have time at the end for any questions that you might have. We have a lot of information to cover today, and our outline will look like this. We'll start by talking about what self-advocacy really means. So we'll dive into this topic. I'll share information about how I personally conceptualize self-advocacy, and I'm hoping that you may be able to relate to some of that information and redefine how you think of self-advocacy in your own life. Then we'll talk about some impacts of disability and gender minority stereotypes. There's a double minority status there as an individual who has a disability, but also an individual who identifies as a woman. As a woman with muscular dystrophy myself, using a wheelchair, I've definitely faced some of those microaggressions or stereotypes of being a disabled woman. So I'll share some of that with you. I'll talk about these impacts, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to relate to a lot of that and reflect on your own experiences. Then I'm going to present some self-advocacy tips. So these will be those tips and strategies and ideas, ways that you'll be able to strengthen your own skills for self-advocacy. And then we'll open it up to questions. And I'm hoping we can have some good discussion at that time. So please feel free to take note of your questions or write them down or put them in the chat so that when we get to that portion of today, we'll be able to have a lot of open discussion time where I can answer some of your questions. So what is our goal for today? Well, we have two different goals. Today we're talking about self-advocacy, specifically as it relates to women with disabilities or women with paralysis, because there are a lot of stereotypes and socialized patterns of thinking in the world that can be very limiting for women with disabilities. So we're going to talk about these because we hope that by highlighting these stereotypes and understanding them better, we will be able to exert greater control over them and set ourselves up to overcome those stereotypes. So the goal is to increase our awareness, increase our power, and increase our skills for becoming successful self-advocates as women with disabilities. The whole point of this conversation is empowerment. We want you to walk away from this presentation today with greater knowledge on the intersections of advocacy, disability, gender, assertiveness, and skills for speaking up. So those two goals for today. One, we have to understand these things. So we'll be working to understand the stereotypes and socialized patterns of thinking. And our second goal is to empower, because we want to empower ourselves today to become stronger in this area. And ultimately, we're doing this because your voice matters. I want all of you to know that you have a voice. Your voice matters. What you have to say is important. Your internal experiences are important. It's important that you have your needs met. And as we all know, sometimes having a disability means that some people in the world might not understand our needs. We might not feel understood all the time, or we might have difficulty overcoming those barriers. So as a community of women with paralysis, there's probably a lot of times in your life where you may have experienced feeling like you really have to make your voice feel heard. You have to stand up for yourself, and you have to work to find mutual understanding between yourself and the people with whom you're communicating with, whether it be an insurance provider or a teacher or an employer. And we'll talk more about where self-advocacy shows up in our lives shortly. So what is self-advocacy? How do we conceptualize this concept? If you want to get technical, there's a lot of different definitions in the literature. If you look in the scholarly sources of the literature and dive into the research, a lot of scholars have defined self-advocacy in different ways. And we'll talk about some of the major themes that I have pulled out and some of the major themes that I feel resonate most with women with paralysis. So, to me, and I'm hoping that some of this will relate to you, self advocacy is learning how to speak up for yourself. I've seen that in the research a lot. It's about defining your own life, it's about learning the skills to be able to have your voice heard. Self-advocacy is also learning how to be assertive when explaining your needs. So it's not just telling someone what you need, but confidently being assertive when explaining your needs, presenting that information as if it's a necessity, because after all, it is a necessity. You didn't ask to have paralysis, you didn't ask to have a disability of any type. No one does, but rather you have this that you're managing in your life, and you have certain needs or accommodations that you need to have in order to thrive. So, learning how to assertively talk about those things is really an important part of self advocacy. It's also learning how to obtain those needed accommodations or resources. It's about being able to make your own decisions about your own life, being able to utilize information and resources to your advantage. So, navigating the healthcare arena, navigating the nonprofit world, being able to work with agencies and organizations in order to use that information and those resources to your advantage. It's also about knowing what your rights and responsibilities are. So, really understanding what you have a right to. For example, in school, it's a law that individuals with disabilities have to have accommodations, reasonable accommodations, if that's what they need in order to thrive academically. And it's no different in the workplace. Individuals with disabilities are protected under the ADA to have reasonable accommodations in the workplace. So, self advocacy is really about knowing what your rights and responsibilities can be. It's about strategically using the support of others to help you accomplish your goals. So, self advocacy certainly doesn't mean that you have to do everything by yourself all the time. Not at all. Sometimes it means that we have to think strategically about where we can connect with people, people who have certain expertise or certain privileges, and how we can make those connections to help us accomplish our goals. And sometimes self advocacy comes down to not giving up, not giving up or backing down when faced with opposition or barriers. So I want to ask all of you today to reflect on this. What else would you add to this list? Consider what self advocacy means to you as we go through this presentation. What do you think it means to be a strong self advocate? What does that look like? Remember, it's okay if your ideas about self advocacy are slightly different from your peers. That's okay. We might all have different experiences with self advocacy, and we might define it differently, but that's okay. The important thing is for you to understand self advocacy in a way that feels most empowering to you. For me, I believe a strong self advocate is someone who is able to understand what their needs are and is able to communicate about their needs in order to accomplish their goals. Simply put, I believe the goal of self advocacy is for you to decide what you want and then develop and carry out a plan to get it. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. Okay, we are going to go through some quick true or false questions here to further explain self-advocacy. Now, this first one is a very easy one since I just spoke about this in the last slide. Being a strong self-advocate means that you have to do everything yourself. True or false? I'm hoping that you'll be able to recognize that fairly quickly as false, because that's not true. In fact, sometimes being a strong self advocate means that you have to recognize what you want, but also recognize that you're ill equipped in some way. So you strategize, like I mentioned, and intentionally seek out guidance from an expert or someone with greater knowledge or someone with resources who can help you along the way. And that's absolutely a part of self advocacy because you're still explaining what you need and what you want, but you're just getting some resources or some expertise to help you along the way. Okay, next true or false question. Self advocating about your personal needs is easy. Not true. This is false because it might feel really scary or really intimidating to have to speak up and communicate about your needs. I know that that can be really overwhelming sometimes, but with practice, it will become easier over time. Speaking up can help make sure that you get the accommodations or the services that you need to live your best life. It can also help educate the other person who you're talking to and help increase their awareness of disability, diversity, and inclusion. True or false? As a self advocate, you should apologize for your needs. False. This is absolutely not true. It's really important that you practice being unapologetic as a self advocate. So keep in mind that you didn't ask to have paralysis. It's not something that you can control, it's just part of your life that you have to manage. So I want you to challenge any internal beliefs that may limit you and practice speaking confidently about what your needs are so that you can take control over your life and reclaim the power that you have. As a therapist, this is one of the biggest things that I work on with my clients, reclaiming the power that they have. And a lot of times that goes along with learning to be unapologetic for who they are and avoiding those tendencies to apologize for their needs. True or false? Self advocacy is rarely met with opposition. So this is false again, not true, because sometimes being a strong self advocate means that we have to, unfortunately, experience difficult conversations with people who misunderstand our needs. Sometimes we have to develop the skills to cope with that distress so that we can push forward through that opposition and remain dedicated to achieving equal access, services, or opportunities. So, where does self advocacy take place? Well, self advocacy can take place anywhere. There's actually no limits to this. So, sometimes self advocacy is within your families and social circles. So, this is about helping people in your own personal life understand your needs. This might look like explaining to family members that holidays must take place in a wheelchair accessible home. It might include asking friends about the details of events in advance so that you can plan for any accommodations that you might need. This can also look like being able to openly discuss your paralysis with a romantic partner without apologizing for your needs. So, within your families and social circles, it's all about explaining to the people who are closest to you what your needs are without apologizing and planning those things in advance, like going to events or having family gatherings. Self advocacy may also occur within your wider community. This is about assuring your equal access to community participation. So, this might look like writing a letter to a restaurant owner to explain that the building is not accessible for you, or calling a concert venue in advance to ask about accessible seating options, joining a local committee to represent the needs of individuals with disabilities in the City Hall decisions. Or if you need caregiving assistance, this might look like confidently explaining exactly how you prefer your care to be done. Self advocacy may also occur within your K 12 school or on college campuses or in graduate school, whatever your academic life looks like. This is about securing accommodations so that you can thrive academically. This might involve communicating closely with your teachers or professors to talk about your classroom accommodations, meeting with college advisors or administrators to be granted wheelchair accessible housing on campus. Maybe it's advocating for inclusive programming so that you can fully participate in extracurricular school activities. All of these things would involve self advocacy because you're advocating to have your needs met within the school setting. Very similar to school, you have rights for accessing accommodations within your employment setting. So, under the ADA, like I mentioned, you have those protections. So, it's absolutely okay to ask for accommodations to succeed in the workplace. This might involve talking with your employer about the accommodations that you need. communicating to ensure that you have access to wheelchair accessible parking, bathrooms, and other spaces, or being able to establish healthy relationships with colleagues where you feel included as a woman with paralysis. So, all of these things and more may show up in the workplace, and this may require you being a strong self advocate for yourself in order to have a positive work experience. Probably most of you are familiar with navigating healthcare centers or clinics and knowing that you do have to speak up about your differences and your needs and any accommodations that you might need in your healthcare. So, this is about getting your needs met to maintain your health and wellness. This might mean keeping up with your sexual and reproductive health needs and not being overlooked as a woman with paralysis. Absolutely. We want to make sure that you're treated equally and that your medical professionals don't have any bias or stereotypical assumptions about your sex life as a woman with paralysis. It's also about directly asking all your questions to your healthcare team and ensuring that you receive appropriate answers. Self-advocacy may show up in healthcare by receiving any needed accommodations for medical treatment, such as if you need a caregiver or someone present to help you transfer for a medical procedure or a test in the office, you should have that accommodation. And if needed, you may have to self advocate for yourself to ensure that you have mental health care from providers who fully understand disability and paralysis. So it's all of these things. In order to be a positive advocate when it comes to your health, you want to be thinking about these things and making sure that you have the confidence and the opportunity to speak up for yourself. And finally, self-advocacy may show up when you're communicating with insurance companies or other service providers. This is really about ensuring that you have healthcare coverage, equipment, or services that are needed for your quality of life. So, this might include communicating about what equipment or medical supplies are needed and then creating a plan for receiving it. And as a self advocate, when it comes to insurance or other service providers, you may have to directly confront individuals when there are issues with coverage, delivery delays, repair needs, or other concerns. That can be really important as well. So now we're going to transition to talk about the impacts of disability and gender minority status. Like I mentioned earlier, as women with disabilities, we're facing both of these minority statuses, and that can take a huge toll on our mental health, on our ability to advocate for ourselves, and that's why this conversation today is so important. So we're going to talk about disability stereotypes and gender socialization patterns. So for women with disabilities, like I said, we're facing double oppression. And what I want you to do in this moment is reflect on what does that look like for you? How might this influence your experiences with self-advocacy? Do you identify as a woman with a disability because of your paralysis? How does that impact your life, socially or professionally or academically? Think about all of those settings that we just went over. And of course, self advocacy may show up in further settings as well that I didn't go over. Self advocacy can show up in any area of our life. So, as we talk about these issues, think about how this impacts you. And maybe this might be the first time that you're reflecting on these concepts, and that's okay. If this information is really new to you, that's okay. This is a great opportunity to be introduced to these subjects. So first we'll talk about the impact of disability. So the impact of having a spinal cord injury or living with paralysis. So unfortunately, because of widespread social inequalities, chronic misunderstandings of disability, and a lot of limited exposure to the realities of life with a disability, many people in the world have misconceptions, right? They have inaccurate ideas about what it actually means to have a disability. And I know that many of you have experienced this where you might be adjusted or well adjusted to living with paralysis if you have had a spinal cord injury many years ago. If you've been living with an injury for most of your life or many years of your life, you might be well adjusted, you might be living a normal life, and then sometimes you might come across someone in public or someone that doesn't know you very well that will make a lot of assumptions about what you're going through, what your life is like, and that can be really hurtful. Same for individuals that are newly injured. If you're newly injured and you're experiencing paralysis for the first time, you're going through so much trauma, so much adjustment, so much healing and recovery. And similarly, you can also be misjudged by other people that don't quite understand disability. You can have exposure to people that may treat you differently, and that can be really hurtful. So, unfortunately, because of all of these widespread misunderstandings and misconceptions, it can position people with disabilities as a minority group that diminishes their voice or ability to speak up. So, individuals with disabilities may be perceived as less intelligent than they are, which is really sad and unfortunate because that can be really hurtful and it can be very limiting for people when they are perceived as less intelligent than they are. That can lead to a lot of internalized ableism, and that is something that I'm always trying to speak out about so that we believe in the potential of individuals with disabilities and have high expectations for individuals with disabilities. Individuals with disabilities may also experience others around them that are acting very uncomfortable. Individuals with disabilities may be socially excluded due to the lack of inclusive spaces or practices. They may be subject to other people speaking over them. So this is a big one, especially if you had a spinal cord injury earlier in life to the point where you've been living with paralysis ever since the period of adolescence. Sometimes for adolescents and young adults, it's really hard to find their voice because they have all of these teachers or healthcare professionals or, physical therapists or all these people that are subjects of authority that are speaking over them, and that can be really limiting for their own empowerment. Individuals with disabilities may also be given less information because they're not perceived as capable of autonomy. Again, a really sad stereotype that exists. Or they may be ignored by professionals, as professionals may speak to caregivers or parents rather than the individual. And I hate when this happens. I absolutely hate it when I hear stories about an individual that uses a wheelchair and they're almost just ignored or disregarded because a professional might have stereotypes or bias or, not view the individual as a fully functioning, capable adult. And that's really hurtful and that can be very limiting for an individual's sense of empowerment. So, what else would you add to this list? Think about some of the other stereotypes or subtle microaggressions that you may have experienced because of your identity as an individual with a disability. Unfortunately, all of us with disabilities usually experience at least some oppression like this at some point in their lives. And this takes a big toll on mental health, on the ability to practice self advocacy, because you may feel exhausted, feeling exhausted, having to overcome all of these stereotypes all the time. You may feel chronically misunderstood, you may feel isolated from the mainstream community, or you may feel like your voice is being diminished because of these stereotypes. And if you experienced any of these things in your life, it makes sense that you might lack some motivation or confidence for speaking up. But rather than blaming yourself for that, today I really want to encourage you to externalize the cause of your discomfort with self advocacy. So instead of blaming yourself or thinking of yourself as someone that's just not capable of self advocacy or, just not skilled enough, I don't want you to blame yourself. Instead, I want you to externalize the cause, because your discomfort or your lack of confidence with advocacy is probably stemming directly from these social stereotypes rather than any internal deficits on your part. So it's not you, it's society. It's not like you have internal deficits. I want you to reframe that concept if you're blaming yourself, and instead look at your discomfort as something that is directly caused by the social stereotypes with which we live in. All of those things have a huge impact on us. So now we're going to talk about the impact of gender. And we're going to consider the impact of gender oppression, because historically women were dominated by males. Certainly, we've come a long way since the women's rights movement, but women are still considered a minority group because of how many gender inequalities still exist today. So gender socialization differences. What I mean by that is beginning at birth, when a baby is born, most families treat boys and girls very differently, and this has a profound impact on who they become. The process of gender socialization means that children grow up learning about their gender based on what their parents expect for their gender. In addition to the influence of parents, children usually prefer to play with peers that share similar interests or who they believe share those interests, and this makes them more likely to be socialized by their same gender peers. Right? So, for example, girls might really feel more comfortable or more attracted to playing with other girls in kindergarten or first grade, second grade, while boys may sort of congregate together on the playground and play with each other. Boys and girls do tend to naturally segregate a little bit when they're selecting their peers to play with. And while spending time with their friends, boys and girls learn about their gender. They learn what is appropriate for one gender or the other. So for girls, we're going to see a lot of pink outfits, flowers, Barbie dolls, arts and crafts, playtime that includes cooking or sewing, makeup, or dresses. Girls are often expected to be quiet, accommodating, patient, emotional, or ladylike. Girls are told that they're pretty or cute more often than smart. Girls are more encouraged to talk about their emotions more than boys. Girls receive encouragement for careers like nursing, teaching, fashion, and of course there are exceptions, but these are some of the biggest patterns that we notice in the mental health field and that we've noticed in fields like psychology, sociology, anthropology. These are the patterns that have been studied. On the other hand, boys are more likely to have blue outfits, camouflage, monster trucks, playtime that includes using tools or sports. Boys are often expected to be leaders, opinionated, athletic, aggressive, or protective. Boys sometimes may be excused for roughhousing around. You may have heard statements like, oh, boys will be boys. They're just wrestling in the backyard. That's typical. That's just boy behavior. Boys are typically told that they're strong, that they're brave, or that they're tough. Showing emotions is discouraged among boys, or at the very least, not as encouraged as it is for girls. And boys sometimes receive encouragement for careers like business owners, doctors, lawyers. And again, there are exceptions, but these are some of the biggest patterns that we've seen throughout history. So I want you to think about the gender socialization that occurred in your family. If you have brothers, does any of this resonate with you? In your experience as a girl growing up, were you often navigating your life through Barbies or dress up or having pink clothing? What was expected of you? And it's true that maybe pink was your favorite color and you deliberately chose to play with dolls and that you deliberately wanted the Easy Bake Oven or, the Sky Dancer toys or any of the toys that were marketed to girls. But it's also safe to assume that part of your interest was because all of those things were marketed toward girls, where at the same time in advertising and in marketing, probably a lot of the sports equipment or the monster trucks or the toolkits were probably marketed more toward boys. So those are some of the gender socialization patterns that we've seen across the decades for boys and girls growing up a little differently. I do want to acknowledge here that, especially in the last decade or so, our society has gained tremendously more acceptance of individuals who are gender non-conforming, such as individuals who identify as non-binary or as transgender, and that's completely valid. I work with many individuals who are proud members of the LGBTQIA plus community, and I just want to say that those experiences are absolutely valid. Your authenticity is true. And if any of you listening identify in that way, I want to normalize your experiences and let you know that that is completely valid and that's completely okay. And you should be proud of who you are. And you shouldn't have to hide yourself or any of your identity. We want you to be open about your experiences and how it may differ from the socialization patterns that I just explained. However, for the purpose of this presentation, where we're analyzing the socialized patterns of gender, it's still accurate to say that most families across the history of the United States did raise boys and girls very differently, and that does lead to different gender stereotypes and personality differences between adult men and women. So what are some of these gender stereotypes that have resulted because of the gender socialization patterns? Well, for one, men are expected to be self-confident and assertive, while women are expected to be accommodating, passive, and emotional. So think about how this can impact self-advocacy. Sometimes it's important to be assertive when advocating, right? When we're trying to explain our needs to other people, we're trying to advocate for ourselves. And sometimes advocating can feel really challenging for you if you struggle with self confidence. You might feel obligated to be overly accommodating to other people. You might also feel like it's not your place to speak up because of these gender stereotypes. Or even subconsciously, you may be more passive as a woman because of these stereotypes, and that can have an enormous impact on your ability to self-advocate. Men are also more likely to communicate as a way to maintain their status and their independence. So they're probably communicating as a way to negotiate for power, to seek wins, avoid failure, and offer advice or other types of ways to exert their power and control. On the other hand, women tend to view communication as a path to create friendships or build relationships. So women use communication as a way to get closer, as a way to seek understanding, or as a way to find some type of equality or symmetry among people. So because of these gender stereotypes, women may be reluctant to speak up and advocate for their equal rights and opportunities because you might care more about hurting another person's feelings or making someone else uncomfortable than about getting your needs met in school or in the workplace. As a woman, sometimes we view communication as this avenue to bond with each other. I know myself included, I really enjoy communication. I really enjoy getting to know people, building friendships. But when it comes to self-advocacy, this might be problematic for the purpose of getting my needs met because it limits my assertiveness as a wheelchair-using woman, and it can portray the idea that my needs are not as important. So I want to encourage all of you to reflect on this and think about whether you have ever sacrificed your needs just to keep the conversation civil in order to avoid conflict. So think about that. Do you avoid conflict? Are you a people pleaser? And if that's a pattern for you, think about how you might be able to change that habit. Remember that sometimes self-advocacy will be met with opposition. We talked about that earlier, and that's okay. The important thing is to continue advocating. Don't give up so that you can access what you need to thrive as a woman with paralysis. Another gender stereotype is that sometimes men use fewer facial expressions than women. Men also smile less. It's just known in the research. Women, on the other hand, tend to rely heavily on facial expression and paralanguage. Paralanguage is when women say, yeah, oh, okay, sure, yeah, yeah, I understand. So a lot of head nodding, right? Nodding your head, smiling, saying, oh yeah, okay, sure, I understand. And these gestures that are more common in women are a mechanism to convey, I'm listening. I understand what you're saying. I get it. I hear you. I validate you without actually saying that directly. So, as a self advocate, I want you to consider if you do that too much. Consider your facial expressions when self advocating. Because if you find yourself doing that way too much, smiling too much, coming off as overly passive, overly accommodating to people of authority, particularly men, you may be perceived as someone that will not fight for what they want and what they need, right? If we're being overly empathetic, if we're saying, oh sure, yeah, I understand, okay, yeah, well, if you say so, I guess that's how it is. If we're kind of overly passive like that, it will be very easy for that person of authority to dismiss you, right? They'll have greater confidence saying, no, I don't think we can meet that need. It's just not something that we can do. And that's what we want to avoid happening. We don't want that person of authority to simply dismiss you, right? You want to be positioned as someone that is going to be taken seriously. You want to push for what you need to be accommodated as a woman with paralysis. There are so many times in our lives as women with disabilities where we're going to be written off. We're going to be dismissed. Unfortunately, like I said, there's just a lot of disability stereotypes combined with gender stereotypes, and that may happen from time to time. But that's what we want to emphasize here. We want you to fight for what you need. So avoid some of this overly passive behavior. If you're relying too heavily on facial expressions, like smiling too much, or being too understanding or too empathetic, you may want to think about that behavior and think about if there's any way to position yourself as someone that might be taken more seriously so that you can be perceived as someone who is persistent, determined, and not someone who's going to give up easily. Finally, another gender stereotype is that women usually have a smaller range of acceptable behaviors than men. For example, this is that double standard that we often see in the workplace. If women are too nice, you may be judged as weak or manipulative, right? Like as a woman in business, I see this sometimes myself, where if I'm overly accommodating, overly passive, I feel really weak, and I also feel like I'm being perceived as really weak. So you have to work on that confidence. But on the other hand, if you come across as too aggressive, sometimes we can be judged as acting too bossy. And people may think of us as really demanding. They may have really negative perceptions of us, and that can be hurtful for us in the same way. So remember that sometimes we may be misunderstood, and sometimes it may feel like you're in a lose-lose situation, right? Like sometimes as women, especially in the workplace, it feels like we're always having to navigate this balance, right? We're on this balance beam of, well, I don't want to be too passive, but at the same time, I want to be aggressive and assertive, but I don't want to be judged as too bossy. So, as you're navigating that balance, I just want you to remember that it's not your job to please everyone or concern yourself with being liked by everyone. That's an impossible battle to win. If we are too concerned with being liked by everyone, we're not going to be able to achieve that goal because we're not always going to be liked by everyone. Whether in the community or in the workplace, people are going to have their opinions, and that's okay. But our job is not to please everyone. Instead, our job should be to ensure that we're getting the accommodations, the healthcare, the social inclusion, the access, or the services, or the understanding, or whatever it is that we need in order to thrive as an individual who has a disability who is a woman. We need to be able to focus on what our needs are and worry less about being liked by everyone. Okay, so now we're going to dive into some tips and strategies for how to be a stronger self advocate. We've talked about a lot of stereotypes for individuals with disabilities, for individuals who identify as women. And I'm hoping that you were able to combine some of those ideas together so that they resonate with you, whether you've experienced those things in the past or whether you might experience those things in the future. I want to talk about some clear tips and strategies so that you're better prepared to fight for your needs now and in the future. So, my first tip is to strengthen your self awareness. Really have a firm idea on what your needs are. Strengthening self awareness is a great starting point because it helps you understand what your needs are, which is absolutely necessary for self advocacy. How can we possibly advocate for ourselves if we don't exactly know what our needs are? It just doesn't make sense. So, what I want to encourage you to do is reflect on some of these questions and ask yourself about your needs so that you can really understand what exactly you want to fight for. So, what are your needs for school, for employment, for healthcare, for your social life? What do you need in order to live your very best life? How does your disability impact what your needs are? How has your spinal cord injury or diagnosis of paralysis impact what you need in your life to feel included, to feel like a complete, full citizen participating in your community? What are some of the accommodations or resources that you might need? Is it wheelchair accessible transportation? Is it accommodations at your job? Is it knowing exactly where you can find accessible recreation? Is it knowing how to get accessible seating at sporting events or at concerts? What are some of the things that you need to thrive in the community? Why is it important for you to have your needs met? So, really think about that. Think about why it's so important for me to have my needs met. I would argue it's incredibly important, right? It's critical for you to fully participate, for you to be included, and for you to live your best life with the best mental health that you can have. How do you communicate or advocate about your disability? How do you talk about paralysis? How do you explain your needs to other people? Do you have experience doing that? Have you had experience advocating before? Or would this be something totally new to you? And if it's new, that's okay. You're starting somewhere by just participating in this presentation. You're starting to think about all these ideas, and that's amazing. It shows that you have enormous strength and resiliency and persistence, and you are committed to advocating for yourself, and that's something to be celebrated. Some broader questions might include, what does my disability mean to me? How do I talk about paralysis? How does this impact my identity? How much or how little do I identify with disability? What are my beliefs about individuals with disabilities or paralysis? How do I relate or not relate to stereotypes? So this is really good information that you might want to talk about with some of your peers in the paralysis community, talking about these stereotypes and having conversations about how you identify and how you don't identify. What are your values as a person with a disability? How much or how little does your disability impact who you are as a whole person? And I want to remind you here that there's absolutely no right or wrong answer. There's just no possible way for someone to be correct or incorrect when you're answering these questions. So I want you to let your mind wander, let yourself explore, Maybe journal about these questions. And if you're struggling with this, if this is bringing up a lot of trauma or a lot of negative emotions, remember that you can reach out for help from people in your community, from your close family and friends, from your mentors, or from professional mental health counselors. These are a lot of the same questions that I work with clients with disabilities who want to start exploring some of their disability identity in order to feel more empowered. So if you're struggling with this, just know that help is always available and you don't have to face this alone. Okay, so a next step for strengthening self-advocacy skills is to develop a vision. After you have a clear understanding of what your needs are, the natural next step is developing a vision. And this makes sense because most people have a very difficult time advocating for something when they don't have any idea of what they're trying to accomplish. Anytime that we go into an act of self advocacy, when we go and have a conversation, when we make that phone call, or we go and have a meeting, or we write a letter, or we try to do something that looks like advocating, it's going to be so much easier when we have a plan, when we have a clear vision of what we want to get out of that conversation or that meeting. So, some really, really good questions to consider are, what do I want this person to grant me? Is it a service? Is it allowing me to have an accommodation? Is it reconsideration of a policy? What do I want to get out of this? What do I want this person to grant me? What information do I need from this person? Is there something that they're going to be able to tell me? Is there something that I need to know from this person? Overall, what is the outcome that I hope to achieve in this conversation? Again, really similar to just what do I want this person to grant me? Thinking really broadly about what is the outcome that I want? What is that ideal outcome? It's also really important to consider, how am I going to explain what my goal is? Maybe I should practice that with a friend or family member, someone I trust. Maybe I should role play this conversation. How will I explain what my goal is? It's really important to practice that. And why is your goal so important? You have to think about how the other person might respond to you. They might have questions for you. They might not understand the importance of your goal. They might not see the validity of it. They might hear you, but they might say, yeah, I understand you want this, but I don't really get why it's so important. So you have to be prepared to respond to that by justifying what you're asking for. If you're asking for an accommodation, for example, you really want to have a clear vision for why that is so important. So in the workplace, you might know that having a different type of workspace, or maybe working remotely, or just having any type of accommodation, that might help you fulfill your goals at work. It might help you perform better. It might help you do the best job that you can so that you can thrive in the workplace. But I want you to think about why that is. I want you to have some evidence, some justification, so that when you go into that meeting with your employer, or you have that conversation, you're able to explain why that goal is so important, why that goal matters to you, and how that goal can help fulfill your needs. When people have a clear vision for what they need, why exactly they need it, why it's important for a person's safety, quality of life, or equal access to something, they're usually much more successful in accomplishing their self-advocacy goal. So keep that in mind. Always develop your vision. Number 3, acknowledge obstacles. This is really important because when we're blinded to the barriers that exist, it can certainly make them much more difficult to overcome. Sometimes talking about disability barriers can be difficult or painful. It might bring up some trauma, some negative emotions. You may find yourself wanting to only focus on the positives, so people might sugarcoat things or put a positive spin on everything. And it can be really hard to have those conversations. It can be really hard to acknowledge your obstacles because sometimes we don't want to acknowledge disability barriers if they bring up negative feelings. But what I have found to be true over the years of experience that I have helping people and families affected by disabilities is that ignoring the obstacles doesn't make them go away. Just like ignoring our emotions doesn't make them go away. Acknowledging our obstacles helps us take more control over them because it positions us to carefully plan around the barriers and develop solutions for attacking what stands in our way. I talk about this all the time as a therapist, right? We bottle things up so often. We don't want to acknowledge some of the mental health struggles that we have. Maybe we don't want to acknowledge some of the disability related barriers. But what happens is it builds up inside of you. And without being able to openly acknowledge these things and self express yourself, it's really hard to overcome these things. It's really, really tough to feel like you can heal from them or like you can exert control over them. So, by acknowledging our obstacles, that is a much healthier approach than avoiding them. If we can acknowledge them, we're going to have more success in overcoming them. So, some really good questions to ask yourself include: what are the obstacles that pose a threat to having my needs met? Is it a lack of resources? Is it people of authority? Is it a law or a policy or something else? Do I know others who face the same obstacles? How have they overcome these obstacles? What knowledge or guidance might I need to face these obstacles? And if the obstacles cannot be changed, what else are my options? What other avenues can I explore? The answer is usually not to give up. Very, very rarely is that an answer. In most cases, even if the obstacle cannot be changed, we can still strategize what other options might exist or what other avenues we can explore. So, again, just reflecting on these things can be really healthy and can help you a lot in your efforts to self advocate for yourself. Number 4, we have to remember our strengths. So I want you to think about what you're good at. Every single person has internal strengths and resources that can help them in their self advocacy efforts. Sometimes I know it can be really hard to identify what strengths we have, especially if we don't spend a lot of time reflecting on what we're good at. So you may find it helpful to talk with your family or friends or a counselor or some people that you feel safe with to help you reflect on what you know to be true about yourself, to talk about the things that you're good at, to get feedback from other people, to go through this process of self discovery so that you have a really firm grasp on what your strengths are. And I want to give you some examples of what strengths that you probably have already. And these would be particularly useful for self advocacy. And I bring up a lot of these strengths because most people that live with paralysis or disability of any kind have a lot of adaptation skills, determination, resiliency, empathy, resourcefulness. A lot of these skills listed here are naturally within you already. So think about how any of these may resonate with you and what other skills you would add to this list. There are a lot of different types of skills that can be important for self advocacy, and sometimes just reflecting on what you're really good at can help you increase your confidence and sense of empowerment in order to be successful as a strong self advocate. There are so many strengths that you might be holding within yourselves. And whatever strengths you have, you can always find ways to bring them into the picture when you're advocating for yourself. So reflect on some of these and maybe take the time to make a list so you have it on paper. So when you are doubting yourself or you're feeling a bit insecure, you have that list of strengths that you can remind yourself about. Number 5, believe in your self-worth. Absolutely. I really want every single one of you to know that you deserve to have your needs met. I think this is one of the most critical tips for self-advocacy because you have to always believe in your self-worth. Always remember that you are worthy of having your needs met. Remember, like I said earlier, you didn't ask to have paralysis. It was never something that you wanted or that you signed up for. So you don't have to apologize for it. You don't have to feel bad about asking for any accommodations. You don't have to feel like you have to apologize for any limitations that you might face. You should never apologize for what your needs are. Always remember that living with paralysis or disability of any kind might make things more complicated, right? We're facing all these complicated challenges as wheelchair users, but it doesn't make you any less deserving of equal opportunities. So I'm a really big fan of positive affirmations, especially when we're facing those insecurities or when we feel guilty or maybe we feel like a burden or we feel like in some ways we have to apologize or like we want to give up. I really want you to challenge those negative thoughts inside of you. I want you to be able to reframe your perspective so that you can regain your power, regain your sense of empowerment and feelings of control. So these are just some positive affirmations that you may want to say to yourself or to write down on a piece of paper, maybe along with your list of strengths. These can be really helpful in moments of high anxiety and distress. I deserve to have my needs met and I will advocate for what I need. I don't have the answers right now, but I will continue working to overcome barriers. I will advocate for myself so that I can live my very best life. It's okay to face opposition. I will keep trying. I have a strong, powerful voice. My voice matters, and I deserve to feel heard. And there are so many more positive affirmations that you may think of. So get creative. Come up with some that work well for you. Another example might be I am a whole, complete person. My disability does not change that. I really like that one. I also like I deserve equal opportunities, inclusion, fair treatment, positive relationships, and respect. Or I am more than my disability. Paralysis is just one part of my life. So I want you to think about what positive affirmations or what statements might resonate most with you. Which ones might make you feel better in moments of high anxiety? And how can you practice these things to keep and maintain a strong sense of empowerment over time? Seek out resources so you never have to face things alone. Talk with other women with paralysis to share your experiences and seek peer support. Connecting with others within the Christopher Dana Reeve Foundation or other similar organizations can be a huge source of comfort as you continue learning about self-advocacy. Lean on the advice and the support from other people in your shoes. Peer-to-peer support is one of the most valuable sources of coping for many people because being able to relate to others and establish a strong sense of belonging within a community can also help you increase your confidence and empowerment skills, which ultimately strengthens your ability to self-advocate. So check into some local advocacy groups, disability organizations. Maybe you might need to seek some legal advice from a special needs attorney or nonprofits. Overall, don't be afraid to ask for help. You should never have to face things alone. I hope you found this information helpful today. Remember that self-advocacy is a learning process, and all of you are capable of becoming a strong self-advocate. My contact information is on this slide. I encourage you to email me if I can ever be a resource for you. Don't hesitate to reach out. And now at this time, I would love to open it up to questions and answer anything that you might have on your mind.